This story begins from high, as a simple diary, a collection of thoughts, struggles, and fleeting triumphs written by a man who lived through the California gold rush. Each page holds the echoes of a distant time, where dreams of gold clashed with the harsh realities of life. It's more than just a recounting. It's a journey into the heart of ambition, loss, and discovery. Let these words guide you into a world where every moment was a gamble, and the true treasure was never the gold. The year was 1848, and the world around me seemed to vibrate with whispers of opportunity. I was a modest blacksmith in a quiet New England town, content with the predictable rhythm of my days, until one frosty evening when a stranger rode into town. He was a wiry man, his clothes dusty from the road, but his eyes gleamed with an intensity one couldn't ignore. "Gold," he said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper as he leaned across the counter. "Gold in California. More than a man could ever dream." I scoffed at first, dismissing the tale as the ramblings of a wanderer. But as days passed and his stories spread, a fever began to grip our small town. Men who'd never left the county packed their belongings and bid tearful goodbyes. The air was thick with hope and desperation, and before long, I too was caught in its current. My days were consumed by thoughts of golden rivers and endless wealth. Even the clang of my hammer against iron seemed to echo with promise. By the time I sold my tools and boarded the wagon, my heart was alight with a mix of fear and excitement. The journey ahead was unknown, yet it was a calling I couldn't ignore. I kissed my mother goodbye, her eyes misty but understanding. She handed me a worn leather pouch. "For luck," she said, her voice trembling. Inside was a small cross, a keepsake that would remind me of home in the days to come. When I joined a caravan headed west, the roads were swollen with hopeful souls. We were a motley crew, farmers, craftsmen, dreamers, and drifters. There was Samuel, the preacher's son with a golden cross around his neck, and Margaret, a widow with a steely determination that belied her gentle demeanor. Each of us carried a story, a reason for risking everything. Samuel's father had sent him to spread the word of God among the miners, but Samuel's eyes betrayed his own hunger for wealth. Margaret, on the other hand, had lost her husband to the fever and saw California as a chance to rebuild her life. The first nights on the trail were filled with camaraderie. We shared food, laughter, and stories. One man, a former sailor named Thomas, entertained us with tales of his exploits at sea. Another, a quiet farmer named Eli, spoke only when necessary, his eyes always scanning the horizon. But as the days wore on, the hardships began to wear us down. Horses stumbled under the weight of overloaded wagons, and tempers flared in the heat of the sun. One evening, as we camped by a shallow creek, Margaret approached me. "Do you think it's worth it?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Her question hung in the air, heavy with doubt. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that turning back felt as impossible as moving forward. The Sierra Nevada loomed before us like a formidable sentinel, its peaks kissed by snow. Scaling those treacherous heights was a trial unlike any I'd known. We lost a wagon to the raging currents of the Truckee River, and with it, supplies we could ill afford to spare. The roar of the water still haunts me. It swallowed our provisions and nearly took Eli, who had waded in to save what he could. We pulled him out, shivering and gasping, but alive. The incident sobered us, a stark reminder of the dangers ahead. The nights grew colder as we ascended. We huddled together for warmth, sharing what little food we had left. The silence of the mountains was both awe-inspiring and oppressive. Samuel led us in prayer each evening, his voice steady despite the hardships. But I noticed the cracks in his resolve, the way his hands trembled as he held his cross. When we finally descended into the valleys beyond, the sight of green fields brought tears to my eyes. We had survived, but the mountains had taken a piece of each of us. The camaraderie of the trail was replaced by a quiet determination as we neared our destination. San Francisco was a chaos of humanity when we arrived. Ships lay abandoned in the harbor, their crews lured inland by the promise of riches. The streets were a cacophony of hawkers, musicians, and prospectors. It was a city of contradictions, a place where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. I secured a room in a boarding house run by Mrs. Hargrove, a stern woman with a soft spot for stories. She reminded me of my mother, with her no-nonsense demeanor and quick wit. It was there, amidst the clamor of the city, that I prepared for the next leg of my journey, the goldfields. San Francisco at night was a sight to behold. Lanterns cast a warm glow over the bustling streets, and the scent of salt from the bay mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread. But beneath the surface, danger lurked. Pickpockets prowled the crowds, and drunken brawls spilled out of taverns. I kept my head down and my wits about me, determined not to become another casualty of the city's chaos. The goldfields were both a wonder and a horror. Rolling hills were dotted with tents and crude shelters, and the air rang with the sound of pickaxes and shouted curses. I staked my claim beside a creek and set to work, each strike of my pick driven by hope. Days turned to weeks, and though my findings were modest, they were enough to keep the dream alive. But the deeper I delved, the more I realized that gold was not the only thing being unearthed here. Ambition and desperation revealed the true nature of man, and it was not always pretty. Arguments over claims were common, and the sight of a man being dragged from his tent for cheating at cards was a sobering reminder of the lawless nature of the camps. At night, I lay awake in my tent, listening to the sounds of the camp, the laughter of drunken miners, the distant howling of wolves, and the steady murmur of the creek. My body ached from the day's labor, but my mind raced with thoughts of what the next day might bring. The promise of gold was both a blessing and a curse, a beacon that drove us forward and a weight that threatened to crush us. Evenings in the camp were a paradoxical mix of camaraderie and isolation. After a day of backbreaking labor, we gathered around flickering campfires to share stories. It was a ritual as old as humanity, a way to cling to some semblance of normalcy amid the chaos of the goldfields. The flames cast long shadows, dancing on the rugged faces of men and women whose lives had been irrevocably altered by the lure of gold. Samuel often led the conversations, his voice steady and soothing. One night, he recounted his life back home, his father's church, and the dreams he once had of joining the ministry. But out here, he admitted, I've seen a different kind of faith. It's not in the pews or the sermons. It's in the earth, in the sweat of men who refuse to give up. His words resonated deeply with me, though I could see the glint of guilt in his eyes, as if he felt he'd strayed too far from his path. Margaret's stories were less philosophical and more practical. She spoke of her late husband, a carpenter who had built their home with his own hands, and the life they had dreamed of together. Her voice held a quiet strength, and I couldn't help but admire her resilience. He would have laughed at this madness, she said, gesturing to the surrounding tents. But he would have come anyway. He always chased the impossible. Then there was Thomas, the sailor, whose tales grew taller with every retelling. He spoke of storms that could tear the sky apart and treasures buried in distant lands. The gold here's no different, he said one night, his eyes reflecting the firelight. It's just another treasure we'll lose before we even touch it. Not everyone joined the fireside talks. Eli, the quiet farmer, often sat apart, sharpening his tools or staring into the darkness. I wondered what thoughts occupied his mind, what memories kept him silent. The campfires brought us closer, but they also reminded me of how alone we all truly were, each carrying burdens we dared not share. The goldfields were as much a battleground as a workplace. One morning, I awoke to the sound of shouting. Two men were locked in a fierce argument over a disputed claim. The larger of the two, a burly man named Harlan, accused Samuel of encroaching on his territory. Samuel, usually calm and composed, stood his ground, insisting the boundary markers were clear. The argument escalated quickly. Harlan, his face red with anger, shoved Samuel back. Before anyone could intervene, he drew a knife. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers as the blade glinted in the early morning sun. Samuel held up his hands, his voice steady despite the threat. "We're all here for the same thing," he said. "Let's not spill blood over it." For a moment, it seemed Harlan might relent. But then he lunged. Samuel sidestepped, and the two men grappled, the knife falling to the ground. Others rushed to separate them, but the damage was done. Samuel had a gash on his arm, and Harlan was dragged away, cursing and spitting. The incident left the camp shaken. It was a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of civility was. Ambition had turned men into animals, and trust became a scarce commodity. Samuel's wound healed, but his spirit seemed diminished. He no longer led the campfire talks, retreating into himself. I couldn't blame him. The cost of ambition was becoming all too clear. One night, as the fire burned low and the camp had settled into an uneasy quiet, I found myself compelled to share my own story. It wasn't something I often did, but the weight of the past had been pressing on me, and I needed to unburden myself. I spoke of my father, a man whose hands were as rough as the earth he worked. He had been a blacksmith, like me, but his life had been one of endless toil. He poured every ounce of himself into his craft, hoping to give my mother and me a better life. But the years wore him down, and he died young, his dreams unfulfilled. I came here because I didn't want to end up like him. I admitted, my voice trembling. I thought if I could find gold, I could buy freedom from that kind of life. But now I'm not so sure. Margaret reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Your father's dreams weren't wasted," she said softly. "They brought you here, didn't they?" Her words stayed with me long after the fire died out. For the first time, I began to see my journey not as an escape from my past, but as a continuation of it. My father's sacrifices had paved the way for my own, and his dreams were alive in me. While exploring the nearby hills one afternoon, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks. Hidden among the trees was a cluster of small structures, their walls weathered and crumbling, but still standing. They were unlike anything I'd seen before, simple, yet imbued with a sense of history. As I walked through the abandoned village, I felt a profound sense of loss. This had been someone's home, a place of laughter, love, and life. Now it was silent, the echoes of its past inhabitants carried away by time. I found pottery shards scattered on the ground, intricately painted with patterns that spoke of a culture I knew nothing about. It was a sobering reminder that the land we were tearing apart for gold had once belonged to others. Back at camp, I shared what I'd seen with a local historian named Mr. Aldrich. He listened intently, his weathered face thoughtful. "The Miwok," he said, "they lived here long before we came. They thrived on this land, cared for it. And now," he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The encounter stayed with me, a shadow over the golden dreams we chased. It was a stark reminder that our pursuit of wealth came at a cost, one that couldn't be measured in dollars or ounces of gold. The rain came suddenly, transforming the once dusty creek into a raging torrent. At first, we watched from the safety of our tents, marveling at the power of nature. But as the water rose, it became clear this was no ordinary storm. The creek swelled, carrying away tools, provisions, and even entire tents. The air was thick with shouts and the frantic scrambling of miners trying to salvage what they could. I joined the others, fighting against the current to secure my claim. The water was icy, numbing my legs as I struggled to retrieve my tools. It was then that I saw it, lodged in the roots of a fallen tree, a nugget of gold larger than any I'd ever seen. Its surface glistened even in the murky light of the storm, and for a moment, all else faded away. I reached for it, my heart pounding, but the roots held it fast. It took every ounce of strength I had to pry it free. When I finally emerged from the water, soaked and shivering, the nugget clutched in my hands. A cheer erupted from those who had witnessed my discovery. But their joy was not for me. It was for the proof that such riches still lay hidden in the earth. That night, as I sat by the fire, drying my clothes and warming my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nugget was more a curse than a blessing. It had cost me dearly, and I feared it would cost me more. A letter arrived from home the following week, carried by a trader who had made the treacherous journey from the east. The edges of the paper were worn, the ink smudged, but my sister's handwriting was unmistakable. I unfolded it with trembling hands, my heart aching for news of the life I'd left behind. She wrote of the farm, of the struggle to keep it running in my absence. My mother's health was failing, and the crops had suffered from an unseasonably harsh frost. She didn't ask for money, but her words carried the weight of unspoken need. "We miss you," she wrote, "but we're proud of you. Bring home a piece of California for us." The letter stirred a storm of emotions within me. I had come here to secure a better future for my family, but what had I truly achieved? The gold in my pouch felt heavier than ever, its worth diminished by the distance between me and those I loved. That night, as I stared at the flames, I resolved to send what I could back home. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Word of my find spread quickly, as news always did in the goldfields. At first, it brought a wave of congratulations and envy-laden smiles. But soon, the darker side of human nature began to show. I returned to my tent one evening to find it ransacked. My tools were gone, and the small pouch of gold I'd hidden beneath my bedroll had vanished. Rage boiled within me, but there was no one to confront. The thief had left no trace, and the camp's transient nature meant they could be miles away by now. I spent the night repairing the damage, my mind racing with thoughts of vengeance and distrust. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay in this camp much longer. The goldfields had become a place where trust was a liability, and greed was the only law. Before leaving the camp, I sought out Mr. Aldridge, the historian who had shared stories of the Miwok people. He was an older man, his face lined with years of sun and sorrow, but his eyes still held a spark of curiosity and compassion. "The gold rush has cost more than we'll ever truly reckon," he said, his voice tinged with melancholy. "The Miwok, the Yokit, the Pomo, they were here long before us. They thrived on this land, cared for it, and we've torn it apart in our greed." His words struck a chord deep within me. I thought of the abandoned village I had stumbled upon, the pottery shards, and the silent echoes of a life erased. The gold I carried in my pouch felt heavier than ever, a burden rather than a prize. I thanked Mr. Aldridge for his wisdom and promised myself that I would carry his stories with me, even if the world chose to forget them. Leaving the camp felt like shedding a second skin. I traveled alone, my steps guided not by the promise of gold, but by the need to understand what I had become. The landscape changed as I moved southward, from rocky hills to rolling plains, but the questions within me remained constant. Each night, I wrote in my journal by the light of a small fire. I wrote of the people I had met, the struggles we had shared, and the dreams that had brought us together and torn us apart. I wrote of my father, whose sacrifices had inspired my journey, and of my mother and sister, whose love anchored me even from a distance. The act of writing became a balm for my soul, a way to make sense of the chaos and find clarity amid the noise. By the time I reached my next destination, I felt lighter, as if the weight of the past had begun to lift. My next destination was a quieter place, far removed from the chaos of the bustling camps I had left behind. Here, the earth seemed untouched by the frenzy that had gripped the goldfields. The air carried a stillness that I hadn't felt in months, and for the first time, I wondered if peace might be more valuable than any nugget of gold. I staked a modest claim by a creek shaded by willows and set to work. This time, my digging was not driven by the feverish desperation I had once felt. Instead, each strike of the pick was deliberate, almost meditative. I was no longer chasing wealth, but seeking closure, a way to reconcile the dreams that had brought me here with the reality I now faced. As the days passed, I unearthed small flecks of gold, each one a testament to the earth's hidden treasures. But my greatest find came not from the ground, but from within. One evening, as I sat by the creek, watching the water ripple in the fading light, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The gold I had sought was never going to fill the void left by what I had abandoned. It was a means to an end, not the end itself. On the last day, as I packed my tools for the final time, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The goldfields had been a crucible, shaping me in ways I was only beginning to understand. But they had also taken their toll, leaving scars that would never fully heal. With one last glance at the creek, I turned and began the journey home. The road home was long and winding, a journey that mirrored the path my life had taken. Each step brought me closer to the life I had left behind, but also further from the man I had been when I first set out. The landscapes I passed through seemed to reflect my own transformation. The rugged mountains gave way to gentle valleys, and the harsh deserts softened into rolling plains. Along the way, I encountered others making their way back from the goldfields. Some carried pouches heavy with their finds, their faces alight with triumph. Others bore little more than the clothes on their backs, their eyes hollow with defeat. We shared stories around campfires, our voices weaving a tapestry of shared experiences and hard-earned lessons. Each story was a reminder that the gold rush was not just a pursuit of wealth, but a journey of the soul. One evening, I met a young couple heading east to start a new life on a small farm. They reminded me of Margaret, with their quiet determination and unshakable bond. As we parted ways, I felt a pang of hope for them, a hope that they might find the peace and prosperity that had eluded so many of us. When I finally crested the hill overlooking my family's farm, the sight nearly brought me to my knees. The field stretched out before me, golden in the late afternoon sun, and the house stood just as I had left it, a beacon of familiarity in a world that had changed so much. My sister was the first to see me, her cry of joy bringing my mother to the door. She looked older than I remembered, her hair streaked with gray and her frame more frail. But her smile was as warm as ever, and as she embraced me, I felt the weight of the past year begin to lift. That evening, we sat around the hearth, sharing stories of all that had happened in my absence. I spoke of the people I had met, the challenges I had faced, and the lessons I had learned. I handed my sister the pouch of gold I had managed to bring back, its weight a tangible symbol of my efforts. "It's not much," I said, "but it's a start." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "It's more than enough," she replied. In the weeks that followed, I settled back into the rhythms of farm life. The mornings were filled with the familiar tasks of tending to the land, and the evenings brought the comfort of family and home. But the experiences of the past year lingered, shaping my thoughts and actions in ways I couldn't ignore. I began to write in earnest, filling the pages of my journal with the stories of the goldfields. I wrote of Samuel and Margaret, of Mr. Aldridge and the Miwok, of the greed and generosity that defined those fleeting months. Each word felt like a tribute to the people and places that had touched my life, a way to ensure that their stories would not be forgotten. One evening, as I watched the sun set over the fields, I realized that the true treasure I had found was not the gold, but the wisdom and resilience I had gained. The gold rush had been a chapter in my life, but it was not the whole story. It was a stepping stone, a catalyst for growth and reflection. Years later, as I sit by the same hearth, my journal open on my lap, I am struck by how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. The goldfields are a distant memory, their chaos and allure replaced by the steady rhythms of home. But the lessons they taught me remain, a golden thread woven into the fabric of my life. The California Gold Rush may have been a fleeting moment in history, but its impact endures. It was a time of ambition and folly, of sacrifice and discovery. And though the gold itself may have been the spark, the true wealth lay in the stories it created and the lives it shaped. As I close my journal, I feel a sense of peace. The story is not just mine, but ours, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of hope. And as long as the sun rises and sets over these fields, I know that the legacy of the gold rush will live on, not in the earth, but in the hearts of those who dare to dream.